This channel runs on curiosity and support. Hit like, subscribe, and tell me what caught your interest. The routine established at Camp Bright Pine was less a military schedule and more a monastic ritual, performed deep in the bone-chilling folds of northwestern Wyoming. Captain Jonathan Rivers, a man whose spine was set straighter than the mast of a square rigger, conducted his morning perimeter walk. The air, cold and crisp even as the sun climbed the eastern ridges, tasted of three things: sun-baked granite, the sticky, earthy, sweet fragrance of pine pitch, and the pervasive low hum of diesel exhaust from the primary generator complex. The base itself was an exercise in deliberate understatement. 5 anonymous aluminum hangars sitting atop a vast, sprawling underground facility. They operated, as they always had, on the bare minimum of activity required to maintain readiness. Every sunrise here was the twin of the last. Check the razor wire, calibrate the long-range seismic sensors, and oil the moving parts of the heavy ordnance. Rivers understood that boredom was not just their enemy. It was their primary tactical environment. It wore a man down slower than a firefight, but just as surely. Rivers moved past the communication annex. The gravel crunching under his boots sounded loud enough to wake the dead. He stopped, glancing at the thin crescent of the fading moon still visible high above the peaks. He knew the tedium acted as a camouflage, a psychological defense mechanism against the sheer, overwhelming emptiness of the surrounding wilderness. Personnel became so accustomed to nothing happening that when an event did occur, their minds struggled to register it as real. Sergeant Rowan Fisher, the communications specialist, a quiet man from Ohio who fiddled with antennae the way other men fiddled with their wedding rings, met Rivers back at the administrative block. Fisher's voice, usually as level and mechanical as a digital clock, held a tiny waver. Fisher reported that all signals were nominal, broadcast, and reception clear as a bell. Then he hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "Sir," Fisher stated last night around 2:30 a.m., "we had a blip. A brief, unexplainable dropout in the low-frequency band. Not even 30 seconds. Came and went." Rivers frowned. "Interference?" "No," Fisher confirmed, unhappy with the lack of explanation. "It was a total null, Captain. Not static, not crosstalk, just silence. A hard digital silence, like somebody hit the mute button on the entire mountain range." Fisher shrugged. "It is not critical, sir, but it is not typical for this sector. We are in the middle of nowhere. Nothing is out there to cause that kind of draw." "Check the primary conduit and the secondary feed," Rivers ordered, keeping his voice flat. "The winds have not been strong enough to shake a squirrel off a branch, let alone cause 30 seconds of dead air. Run diagnostics deep." Midday brought the scheduled rotation of surveillance tasks. Delvin Norris, a compact pilot with quick hands, prepped one of the experimental ground crawlers, a tracked drone designed to handle the worst high country terrain. The mission was standard operating procedure. Check the status of 3 remote photo trap stations 5 miles due west, nested in a thick patch of spruce and scree. The video feed showed the expected terrain: grainy, washed-out shades of gray and brown, displaying the dense underbrush, stones flattened by years of accumulated pine needles, and the occasional stream murmuring softly in the half-light. It was country that felt untouched, deep and somnolent. Rivers watched the monitor, sipping cooling, lukewarm coffee that tasted of burnt institutional brew. Then the camera, mounted low on the chassis, panned across a patch of damp, reddish clay near a small spring. Rivers felt the muscles in his back tense, a cold, instinctive tightening that had nothing to do with logic. There, imprinted in the soft earth, was a track. It was immense. It was easily half again as long as the largest gray wolf-print Rivers had ever studied in field manuals. The impression showed a distinct, almost human heel structure, wide and heavy, suggesting bipedal capability. But the toes were the defining feature. They terminated in unnaturally wide, deep furrows, clearly left by substantial claws, dragged slightly as the foot was lifted. The image held steady for a sickeningly long moment. Rivers's training immediately offered and discarded rational explanations. A deformed black bear, an unusually large mountain lion, some strange hybrid. The structure of the heel killed those thoughts dead. Rivers leaned forward, his reflection momentarily obscuring the monitor. His voice was a harsh, clipped whisper in the quiet control room. "That," he stated, pointing a rigid finger at the screen, "is absolutely not a bear." The sighting dominated the evening. The team reviewed the footage repeatedly, discussing possibilities. Mutation, unknown coyote breed, a hoax. They still clung to the rational shore. The base settled into its nocturnal silence. Inside the command block, the lights were dimmed to conserve power. The external perimeter was swallowed by the thick, star-guzzling shadows of the surrounding pine forest. 12 o'clock midnight was when the logical explanations failed entirely. The automated perimeter alarms began to fail, one by one. Not simultaneously, but sequentially. The first was the northwest sensor cluster. 15 minutes later, the Midwestern infrared unit blinked out. Another 15 minutes, and the optical sensor array near the old storage shed went dark. They had not failed due to a power spike or a blown fuse. They simply stopped transmitting signal, flatlining on the diagnostic board. Sergeant Fisher confirmed the sequence with grim precision. "They are not malfunctioning, Captain. They are being systematically deactivated. Someone or something is walking the perimeter, and it knows exactly where everything is." This knowledge did not just rattle their calm, it tore it to pieces. Something vast, silent, and intelligent was outside, methodically mapping the boundaries of their existence. The deep dread Rivers had fought all day finally settled over him, cold and heavy as a wet blanket. The air was bitterly cold, the kind of night air that got into the lungs and stuck there like ice chips. Rivers took Chris Gardner, the metal specialist, and Sergeant Fisher, whose eyes now darted constantly into the surrounding blackness, to the point of the first signal loss. Rivers carried his carbine loose and low. The weight provided small, grim comfort against the growing unease. The cold night carried the sharp, familiar scents of pine and wet moss, but Rivers's senses were strained, trying to isolate any competing odor, any hint of something foul or unnatural. When they reached the first deactivated post, Rivers's tactical light beam sliced through the darkness, revealing a scene of impossible violence. The mast supporting the camera array was not merely knocked over or damaged by a storm. It had been twisted at the base. The heavy gauge steel was distorted, coiled and bent inward, as if someone had taken a massive pipe wrench to it and cranked with inhuman force. The plastic housing of the camera itself was not shattered. It was abraded, rubbed smooth, and the thick lens was opaque, coated with a fine, oily residue. It looked like an eye gone blind. covered by a dense, milky cataract. Gardner, a stout man who had spent 20 years handling alloys, ran a gloved hand along the violently contorted steel. His breath plumed white in the narrow cone of light. "This is not a tool, Captain. This is sheer physical power. Whatever did this, it did not use leverage. It used brute force, and a heck of a lot of it." Close by, disturbed by the twisting action, they found the print again. The same giant impression, half man and half beast, set into the soft loam. Rivers knelt, ignoring the bite of the wet earth through his glove. The ground was visibly depressed, the track sitting easily 5 inches deep. Rivers calculated the pressure required for that kind of displacement. It was not just a big animal. It was an animal with tremendous concentrated mass. Nothing catalogued in the zoology of this region, nothing on 2 or 4 legs, weighed enough to press the soil like that. As they began the short trek back toward the weak glow of the base lights, they noticed something far more unnerving than the destroyed equipment. The usual nocturnal orchestra of the Wyoming wilderness had ceased. There was no rustle of small game in the underbrush, no distant, mournful yip of the coyotes on the ridgeline, no sound of the wind sighing mournfully through the high branches of the ponderosa. There was only silence, a deep, unnatural silence that felt like its deliberate suppression. It was as if the natural auditory environment had been swallowed whole by something too heavy, something that required every available decibel for its own terrible existence. Rivers felt the hair prickle on the back of his neck. This silence carried weight, a suffocating vacuum. His internal wiring, the instinct honed by years of active duty, started screaming emergency signals. Logic, which was supposed to be his mainstay, had packed up and left the premises. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the core, that something immense was moving just behind the periphery of his tactical light, just beyond the 9-foot cone of safety. It was not visible, but he felt it as a low, resonant vibration through the soles of his boots. A sensation rather than a sound, a tremor in the very earth that underpinned their fragile existence. "Pick it up," Rivers commanded, his voice barely a rasp. They began to move faster, their boots eating up the distance in quick, segmented steps. Just as they approached the weak security lighting of the main perimeter, a sound erupted from the deep shadow of the forest edge. It was not a growl or a snarl. It was not footsteps either. It was a heavy, dull resonance that traveled not through the air but directly through bone and stone. The noise was too ponderous for a bull elk, too slow and deliberate for a large bear. It carried no accompanying crunch of branches or whoosh of air displacement. It was simply the movement of immense, dense mass. It sounded like a pillar of wet granite being dragged across dry bedrock. Rivers stopped dead, raising his carbine level. His heart hammered a desperate, erratic rhythm against his ribs. The standing order was clear. No firing unless absolutely certain of a target and a threat. But as the low, thrumming resonance pulsed through the night, Rivers realized that certainty had long since abandoned the high country. It was no longer a question of if he would shoot, but only of when. The darkness waited, holding its breath, and the massive, unseen thing moved, its passage a vibration of pure, overwhelming dread. The morning after the perimeter inspection was characterized by a palpable, sickening tension. The air in the command block was thick with the smell of stale coffee, cold sweat, and the electric buzz of overworked monitoring equipment. Laura Painter, the lead analyst, a pragmatic woman who lived by checklists and data points, insisted on maintaining protocol. They had to know exactly what they were dealing with. Delvin Norris, his hands trembling slightly, prepared the ground drone for a second run. This time, the route was altered to skirt the primary area of destruction, and the optical equipment was boosted, high-resolution thermal, enhanced low-light spectrum. Every nerve in the room was strung tight as a banjo string. The drone moved slowly, its camera sending back a continuous stream of gray, damp forest. 4 miles out, the tension suddenly snapped taut. Movement. The video feed, already struggling with the heavy blanket of morning fog that clung to the valleys, captured a shape. It was a figure, impossibly massive, standing on all fours, yet retaining a height that dwarfed the surrounding scrub oak. The creature's pelt actively absorbed light, turning its silhouette into a flat, absolute piece of charcoal blackness against the gray backdrop. Its torso was elongated, disproportionately powerful, and its limbs were long, lever-like mechanisms built for colossal effort. The overall proportions screamed apex predator, but they failed to match any known configuration of muscle and bone. It paused. Then, with an unnerving, deliberate motion, the creature turned its head. The muzzle was long, wolfish, but the movement held a distinct, studied quality: intelligence. It stared directly into the lens of the drone's camera. Rivers, leaning so close to the monitor he felt the cold, static electricity on his face, felt an existential chill. The eyes were the most horrific feature. Unlike nocturnal predators whose retinas reflected light with an eerie glow, these eyes were voids. They were utterly, chillingly black, devoid of reflection, depth, or light. They were perfect apertures, dark holes in the fabric of observable reality. The creature's action that followed was not blind aggression. It was a rational, focused act of sabotage. It did not immediately rush the machine. First, it took one calculated step to the side, then another. It recognized the purpose of the machine, a mechanical eye, and the threat it represented. It arched its immense back, and one of the front paws, a massive, powerful appendage ending in those terrifying spade-like claws, struck the drone. The blow was not a swat. It was a targeted, overwhelming strike delivered precisely to the drone's main relay housing. The signal did not fade out or stutter. It ceased instantaneously. The screen went blank, leaving the image of that monstrous black head fixed in their memories. The last frame captured, a jaw full of grim, terrifying intent. The realization that the entity possessed the intellect to identify and surgically destroy monitoring technology sent a wave of shock through the already brittle team. This was not an overgrown rabid animal. This was a thinking, territorial being. Less than an hour later, the base's oldest, most basic warning system, a high-tension barbed wire arc on the northwest sector, screamed into life. The creature was breaching the perimeter. The air raid sirens, usually only tested during drills, tore through the camp's silence. It was a shattering, metallic sound of escalating crisis. Laura Painter immediately attempted to raise the nearest military installation, 40 miles east, to report the penetration and request immediate extraction. The communication line, however, was silent, not static, not a weak signal, just profound, physical silence. Sergeant Fisher's face was pale beneath the emergency lighting. "It is not interference, Captain. It is dead air." Later, the maintenance crew confirmed Fisher's fears. The main communications cable, a thick, multi-strand fiber optic line buried 2 feet deep, had been exposed, severed, and then physically stretched for several yards. It was not cut by an implement. It was pulled apart by impossible strength. The creature was not just observing or attacking, it was guaranteeing their isolation. The reality sank in like a stone in deep water. They were 8 souls in a concrete box, cut off entirely from the world, and their visitor was already inside the outer wall. Camp Bright Pine snapped into full battle readiness. Helmets were cinched, magazines were checked, and the raw, acrid smell of high explosives replaced the mundane scent of diesel and coffee. Rivers went with a small reconnaissance team to the breach site. The barbed wire, designed to deter human and large animal incursions alike, was not merely torn. The thick metal strands were deeply scored, almost shaved at the points of contact with the creature's body. Clinging to the jagged edges of the wire were tufts of coarse black hair. It smelled overwhelmingly of wet dog, a rank, musky odor, mixed with something sharp and chemical, like the concentrated metallic tang that lingers after a major electrical arc. It was the smell of enormous, sustained physical expenditure. Rivers deployed his small squad to a defensive position near the main northern hangar, utilizing the reinforced concrete walls as cover. The moon, struggling to punch through the high layer of fast-moving clouds, finally offered a weak, shifting illumination. 20 yards away it appeared, the creature. It emerged from the deep shadows of the pine line and stopped. It was standing upright now, balanced on its 2 massive rear legs, using its long, motionless torso for stability. Its height exceeded 8 feet, a massive, muscular column. It exhaled. The sound was a heavy, ragged sigh, a sound that carried across the open ground despite the operating spotlights. Every member of the squad heard it, the damp, deep sound of a powerful bellows drawing air. But the creature did not charge. It did not snarl aggressively, and it did not pace. It just stood. This act of absolute stillness was infinitely more terrifying than any rush or roar could have been. Rivers felt a river of cold sweat snake down his back, pooling at his waistband. The heavy barrel of his weapon felt simultaneously like a useless toy and the only thing tethering him to sanity. Every primal instinct screamed at him to fire, to break the awful stillness with noise and violence. But the military protocol, the deeply ingrained training of caution, held him frozen. Wait. Identify. Minimize collateral damage. The silence stretched, mutating into an exquisite form of psychological torture. A single minute felt like an hour spent under interrogation. The creature existed in a state of suspended animation, a massive black question mark. The high-intensity floodlights mounted on the hangar roof cast a harsh, yellowish glow across the ground. Yet Rivers noticed a sickening anomaly. The shadow cast by the creature was disproportionately dark, deeper than physics allowed, as if the entity actively absorbed the light around it, pulling the very essence of luminosity toward its massive bulk. Rivers recognized he faced not a mere predator. He faced the physical embodiment of a void, a hunger not for meat, but for space itself. After perhaps 30 agonizing minutes of this silent standoff, the creature moved. It did not retreat into the woods, and it did not lunge at the soldiers. It shifted its tactics entirely. It began to move methodically along the line of base structures. Its purpose was chillingly clear. Not the team, but the infrastructure. It approached the thick, insulated fuel line that fed the backup generators. Without pausing, with a single brutal movement, it tore the heavy rubber and reinforced plastic tubing apart. The sharp, cloying smell of jet kerosene instantly saturated the night air. Then it turned its attention to the high-voltage distribution box. Its movement was not the blind fury of an enraged animal. It was the systematic, cold calculation of an engineer of destruction. It attacked the base's life support systems with focus and intent. Rivers watched, horrified, as the creature reduced vital nodes to twisted scrap metal. They were not fighting a beast seeking a meal. They were dealing with an entity seeking total operational silence. It was not about violence against people. It was about ensuring the complete elimination of their presence. The climax of the creature's systematic sabotage arrived with a sudden, deafening finality. K-thwump. Not a massive explosion, but a sharp, localized detonation, followed by an intense flash of searing blue electricity. The creature destroyed the primary generator block. The intense floodlights, the administrative office lights, the ancillary power, it all died instantly. Camp Bright Pine was plunged into an absolute physical darkness, the kind of heavy, suffocating blackness unique to the deep wilderness. Only the critical emergency red lights inside the main command structure flickered on, and the weak, frantic beams of tactical flashlights offered meager, jittering cones of visibility. In the sudden, total darkness, fear became tactile. They heard the creature working. The sounds were horrifyingly mechanical, devoid of any natural animal cry. There was the hideous shriek of sheet metal being peeled away like a tin can, the rending, wet shuck of massive cables being torn and stretched, and then the heavy, deliberate impacts against the concrete foundation, as if the creature were testing the structural integrity of their final refuge. Its behavior was a deep, psychological torment. It was not rushing them. It was not attempting to claw through the walls to get at their flesh. It was assaulting their civilization, their connection, their very notion of safety. It hunted the system, not the soldier. Inside the command center, Laura Painter's face was stark white, illuminated solely by the static hissing on the remaining monitors. She stated the obvious with chilling simplicity. We are completely isolated. No communications, no external power. We are running solely on internal battery reserves. 3 hours, tops if we ration the critical systems. 8 people were sealed inside a concrete tomb, completely severed from the known world. Chris Gardner, moving with a flashlight and a gnawing sense of helplessness through the base's storage bays, reported the state of the motor pool. Almost every ground vehicle was permanently disabled. The creature had approached them and with precision had sliced the heavy-duty tires. Not punctured, sliced, long, clean cuts that rendered them instantly useless. Engines were jammed with dirt or flooded with water drawn from ruptured pipes. The creature had meticulously eliminated any chance of motorized evacuation. It was systematically closing off every possible route of retreat, leaving them only one option: the overwhelming emptiness of the woods. Rivers leaned back against the cold, gritty concrete wall, the vibrations of the methodical destruction overhead resonating through the structure. His decade of experience as a logistician and officer felt entirely meaningless. His opponent refused to obey the rules of engagement. He realized the core truth of the situation. The creature did not want to kill them. It wanted them gone. It was not a military enemy. It was a physical manifestation of a no trespassing sign, written in blood and twisted steel. This is an eviction, the thought hammered through Rivers's mind, sharp and cold. The profound, terrible humility of that realization stripped him of his military confidence. They were not powerful adversaries engaged in a life-or-death struggle. They were vermin being systematically cleaned out of a structure the owner had decided to reclaim. He felt small, insignificant, and completely helpless against a force that operated outside the spectrum of human motivation. The horror was not in the threat of violence, but in the certainty of their utter, profound irrelevance to the thing outside. The creature's sounds continued, the heavy, rhythmic chunk against the metal hatch leading into the maintenance tunnel. It worked with the patience of geological time, assuring the total destruction of everything they had built. Rivers knew they had to find a way out before the concrete box became their shared coffin. The team retreated into the main underground command node, the heart of the facility and its most heavily fortified section. It was encased in 1 foot of solid, reinforced concrete and sealed by a hydraulic steel blast door. They sat in the oppressive quiet, the silence broken only by the faint, high-pitched whine of the critical life support systems drawing on the rapidly diminishing internal battery supply. Then, from outside and directly above them, came a new, horrifying sound. Thud, a deep, reverberating impact. Then another and another. It sounded as if something gargantuan had begun jumping rhythmically on the roof of their bunker. The heavy concrete floor beneath Rivers's feet vibrated, the tremor minor, but enough to communicate the sheer crushing weight of the entity above. It was not a frantic attempt to claw through the concrete. It was calculated. A demonstration of power. A physical statement. I am here. You are trapped. Sergeant Fisher, normally the picture of cool reserve, began rubbing his hands together with nervous, rasping friction. He spoke in clipped, frantic bursts about utilizing the heavy incendiary weapons, about counterattacking, about the need to inflict pain. Rivers cut him off, his voice low and firm, but strained. We do not know what it is made of, Sergeant. We do not know its pain threshold. We would waste our entire ordnance just annoying it. Our job is not to defeat it. Our job is to survive until the scheduled relief. The scheduled relief, the rotary wing aircraft they expected tomorrow at 2:00 p.m., felt 1,000,000 years away. The atmosphere in the cramped bunker was turning toxic. They had retreated physically, but psychologically they were still outside, listening to their world being shredded. The air was heavy, thick with recirculated breaths and the smell of damp earth filtering through the ventilation shafts. Laura Painter spread out the geological maps and the resource schematics on the table. Water and rations were good for a week. Ammunition was sufficient for a protracted short-range firefight, but the critical resource was morale, and that was draining faster than the batteries. They sat in cold, flickering gloom, listening to their fortress being dismantled piece by piece above their heads. It was a mundane, suffocating horror that chipped away at the will to resist. Rivers leaned against the heavy steel door, analyzing the creature's actions as if it were a geopolitical enemy. It was systematic. It was patient. It was thorough. But it was also strangely restrained. If it wanted them dead, it would have been. It had displayed more than enough power to smash through the door. He could not shake the terrifying, intrusive feeling that even through 1 foot of reinforced concrete, the creature's black, non-reflective eyes were still fixed upon them. It was not seeing with vision. It was seeing with intent. He felt its presence, massive, heavy, and ancient, a presence woven into the geology of the Wyoming hills themselves. This was not just an animal. This was a force of will. The rhythmic thudding overhead ceased abruptly. The ensuing silence was somehow worse than the noise. It implied decision. The creature was not done. It had merely paused to determine the next phase of its calculated campaign. Rivers understood then that their bunker was not a sanctuary. It was a staging area for their own expulsion. The greatest weapon the creature possessed was not its claws or its massive weight, but its ability to use isolation and dread to force the team to break itself. They were being gently but irrevocably squeezed out of existence in this high country place. The air conditioner, a non-critical system, finally sputtered and died as the battery power dipped below the threshold. The air immediately became close and stale. The base was collapsing on top of them, and they were running out of time to make a choice. The last trickle of reserve power was failing. The central monitoring system went dark with a weak sigh. The final emergency red light, powered by a dying internal power source, pulsed weakly, casting long, unreliable shadows that danced across the strained faces of the remaining team members. Sergeant Fisher nervously kneaded his hands. The coarse texture of his trousers provided the only audible sound in the quiet space. Gardner sat hunched, staring at the floor, measuring the earth's occasional shiver. Rivers and Painter gathered the survivors for a final critical deliberation. The table, bathed in the sickly red glow, felt like an altar for sacrifice. The choices were brutal and immediate. Stay put, risking being crushed or sealed alive once the creature finished its methodical destruction of the structural supports. Or leave, attempting a 28-mile forced march across rugged terrain to the nearest secondary road. That meant a minimum of 15 hours of punishing foot travel. The silence that followed Rivers's outline of the dilemma was heavy and suffocating. It was Painter, the analyst who had always preached adherence to the letter of the regulations, who broke it. Her voice was quiet, stripped of all bureaucratic stiffness, but utterly firm. "The mission is compromised," she stated, her eyes fixed on the map. "The facility is irreparably damaged and cannot be secured or reused. If we remain, we are choosing to be liquidated inside a trap. We evacuate. Protocol dictates the preservation of personnel when the installation is non-recoverable." She paused, lifting her gaze to meet Rivers's weary eyes. "Captain, we are not retreating. We are executing a strategic change of position. We are ceding the ground." It was the military equivalent of a formal act of capitulation to the unknown. They were surrendering not to a superior force, but to an absolute, uncompromising territorial claim. The preparation for the breakout was swift and grimly efficient. They stripped down to only the bare essentials: maximum ammunition, dehydrated rations, medical supplies, navigation charts, and a small, portable emergency beacon. Everything superfluous, anything that added unnecessary weight or bulk, was discarded. The primary fear was the exit. They would have to open the main hydraulic door, cross the ruined compound, navigate the breached perimeter, and walk directly into the creature's acknowledged domain. While they prepped their packs and checked their weapons one last time, a final definitive sound came from the world above. A great shattering crack and a muffled roar. The creature had located the radio dish and the main satellite mast. It was the sound of total, enforced isolation. Even if they managed to activate the portable distress beacon, they would receive no response, no vector, no confirmation. They were utterly, terrifyingly alone in the high country. Rivers looked at his watch. The red digital numbers seemed mocking in the gloom. He looked at Sergeant Fisher and Gardner, both pale, both focused intensely on the loading of their packs. They were good men, professional men, and now they were reduced to running in the dark from a shadow with too many teeth. He took a slow, deep breath, trying to draw strength from the concrete around him. There was no strength left in this place. The creature had systematically drained it. "We go in 15 minutes, Rivers announced, his voice steady. Low profile, fast movement. Maintain silence. We are shadows now. We do not stop for anything until we are outside the blast zone. We move at 04:45 a.m. That gives us the last hour of deep night." He looked at each man, each face illuminated by the desperate red glow. "Stay sharp. We are alive. That is the only objective left." The silence returned, heavier this time, imbued with the certain knowledge that the creature knew exactly when they were leaving. It waited, somewhere just outside the heavy steel. At 04:45 a.m., in the thickest, most absolute hour of pre-dawn darkness, they cycled the pressure on the hydraulic lock. The massive steel door groaned, a deep, metal-on-metal sound that felt deafening in the universal silence. Cold, damp air rushed in, carrying the concentrated stench of burnt circuitry, kerosene, and freshly upturned earth. Rivers led the way, his flashlight aimed low, illuminating only the ground immediately in front of his boots. Their steps, even carefully measured and placed, sounded like gunshots. Every fiber of Rivers's being braced for the attack. He expected a sudden crushing rush, a guttural roar, the shattering of the final illusion of safety. But the creature knew they were leaving, and it simply allowed them to go. They moved past the wreckage of the surface base, a graveyard of shredded equipment. Twisted vehicle frames, punctured fuel tanks, heaps of coiled and unusable communication wire. The damage was comprehensive, designed to guarantee non-occupancy. The most unnerving element was the absence of the entity. Rivers scanned the shadows constantly, the beam of his light sweeping across the ruined landscape, finding nothing but destruction. The creature was nowhere visible. This passive aggression, this deliberate allowance, was a suffocating psychological weapon. The entity was communicating one clear, horrifying message. The threat is not my claws. The threat is staying here. As they navigated the labyrinth of ruined metal and broken concrete, they came to the outer fence line, the final symbolic barrier between man and wilderness. The razor wire was peeled back, not cut with tools, but cleanly peeled, leaving an open, gaping pathway into the thick pine forest. Before stepping into the blackness of the trees, Rivers paused, scanning the base one final time. His light beam drifted up toward the remains of the tallest structure, the massive steel framework of the northern hangar, now leaning inward like a crippled giant. And there it was. A massive, utterly black silhouette stood atop the shattered wreckage. The creature. It was not moving. It was not preparing to pursue. It was simply watching their exodus. Its posture was massive and still, conveying absolute ownership of the ground they were abandoning. Rivers felt the last vestiges of his military pride drain away. This was not a tactical retreat. It was a desperate flight, ratified by the very thing they feared. They were not escaping a battle. They were complying with an expulsion order. They plunged into the shadows of the woods, moving quickly, silently, following the compass and the terrain map. The fear was still there, but it had curdled into a strange, unsettling freedom. Freedom from the suffocating routine, from the concrete walls, from the protocols that proved useless against a force that defied classification. But the freedom was a lie. They were running from what could not be defeated, fleeing a territorial will that regarded them as nothing more than debris. The farther they pushed into the dark, the clearer the horrifying motive became. The creature was not a predator in search of food. It was a janitor. It did not desire their demise. It desired their absence. The thought struck Rivers with the force of a physical blow. All their advanced weaponry, their fortified bunkers, their millions of dollars in technology, it was all meaningless against this primitive, overwhelming desire for void. It was humiliating. They had been eliminated, not by a hostile army, but by a declaration of boundaries. They continued to run, navigating the uneven ground, using the starlight and instinct, knowing that the massive, watchful silhouette was still fixed on their diminishing presence, ensuring that the camp remained a dark and empty place, claimed by the oldest thing in the hills. The forced march quickly devolved into a punishing test of physical endurance. By midday, a cold, relentless rain began to fall, turning the clay-rich game trails into slick, treacherous mud. The penetrating cold soaked through their uniform layers. Every muscle screamed from the effort, and blisters formed swiftly, unnoticed in the general agony of their overworked limbs. Yet no one complained. They moved as a single, exhausted unit, driven by the memory of the black void watching them from the hangar roof. Civilization was 28 miles away, replaced by the immediate brutal realities of wet stones and biting wind. After 8 hours of relentless travel, they reached a high granite ridge that offered the first unobstructed view back toward Camp Bright Pine. Rivers stopped and raised his field glasses, wiping the rain from the lenses. What he saw confirmed their worst fears. Instead of the cluster of hangars and concrete blocks, a thick, greasy column of black smoke rose into the overcast, rainy sky. The creature had completed its work. It had destroyed the remaining fuel stores and detonated the residual explosives and electronics to guarantee that the site was not only unusable but entirely unrecoverable. The base was gone. A place on a map that no longer contained a function. As Rivers scanned the perimeter of the smoke plume, he noticed a chilling detail that Painter confirmed when she looked through the binoculars. The area immediately surrounding the site was devoid of life. There were no birds circling in the air. The usual signs of small rodents and deer, broken branches, droppings, were entirely absent. The local wildlife, known to be resilient and fast to reclaim abandoned ground, was actively avoiding the ruined camp, circling the destruction in a vast, unnatural arc. The creature had established a quarantine zone. It was not just physical destruction, it was a metaphysical cleansing. The march resumed, the sight of the dark smoke spurring them forward. They used up the last of their daylight hours struggling through a winding canyon path, their exhaustion total. 13 hours into the trek, shivering and soaked, they reached the pre-planned coordinates for the emergency signal. Sergeant Fisher pulled out the portable, hand-cranked beacon. Rivers watched the tiny, fragile antenna ascend into the wet air. They cranked the generator. The sound was a mechanical prayer into the void. 2 agonizing hours later, through the dense, rain-filled air, came a sound that nearly brought Rivers to his knees. The deep, rhythmic whump-whump-whump of heavy helicopter blades. The sound of civilization, of rescue, was almost deafening after the suffocating silence of the deep woods. The rescue bird, a military utility helicopter, descended carefully into a small meadow half a mile from their position. Inside the rattling cabin of the aircraft, surrounded by the indifferent professional voices of the extraction team, Rivers felt profoundly disconnected. He looked down at the endless green carpet of the Wyoming forest, and he knew that somewhere down there, in the shadows and the soil, existed something that had effortlessly redefined his entire understanding of power and control. The trained, logical military officer had died back in that failing concrete bunker. What remained was a traumatized witness. He looked at the vast, silent wilderness and knew it harbored a presence that viewed all human endeavors as temporary, easily dismantled intrusions. The cold realization settled over him. The fight had never been theirs to win. The days following the extraction were a blur of sterile white rooms, incessant medical examinations, and an endless, exhausting cycle of interviews and documentation. Rivers and his surviving team members were subjected to the relentless scrutiny of higher command. No one, from the desk-bound generals to the intelligence analysts, accepted the precise description of the entity. The theories put forward were varied and predictable. A new foreign bioweapon designed to target infrastructure, an undocumented, extremely aggressive mutant, or, the most frequent and insulting suggestion, a shared stress-induced hallucination following fuel and electrical system failures. Rivers maintained a dry, factual account. He spoke only of the physical evidence, the specific, systematic nature of the destruction, the measurements of the tracks, the precise surgical logic of the sabotage. He offered no speculation on what the creature was, only what it did. The bureaucracy, in its infinite wisdom, demanded a neat, containable narrative. The official report that eventually circulated through the secured channels declared Camp Bright Pine lost due to an unforeseen cascading technogenic event, triggered by a combination of electrical short circuits and catastrophic fuel leak, which resulted in a massive, uncontrolled explosion. The creature was never mentioned. The base was deemed irrevocably compromised and far too costly, physically and strategically, to attempt recovery or reconstruction. It was easier to bury the truth than to explain it. 2 weeks later, Rivers was resting in temporary quarters near a large, anonymous airbase. Using old connections within the surveillance infrastructure, he received a small, unauthorized packet of data, high-resolution satellite imagery taken shortly after the incident. The images confirmed what they had seen from the helicopter. Where Camp Bright Pine once stood, there was now a sprawling black scorch mark, a vast, ugly wound in the otherwise pristine high-country terrain. But the final terrifying piece of evidence was in the accompanying meteorological and wildlife migration maps. Across an area spanning many miles around the burn zone, the routes of every large animal, elk, deer, bears, were charted with absolute clarity. Every species was diverting around the coordinates of the lost camp. They moved in a wide, precise, unbroken arc. The zone was occupied, designated as permanently forbidden by the consensus of the wild. In a sealed personal memo that would never officially be filed, Rivers summarized his final conclusions. He sat in the artificial light of a sterile hotel room, the city's endless, meaningless noise buzzing outside, a grotesque contrast to the profound silence of the Wyoming mountains. We attempted to establish a fortress on land that was never ours to claim. We operated under the naive assumption that everything opposing us must have a name, a budget, and a flag. We were fundamentally mistaken. Rivers finally understood the profound, chilling essence of their evacuation. They had not failed to hold the line. They had been allowed to leave. They had encountered not a monster but a primordial ancient landlord. Its goal was not murder or conquest. Its singular, terrifying objective was emptiness. And in the face of an elemental will that demanded void, all defenses, all human presence became meaningless. The base had not been abandoned by military order. It had been vacated by the silent, crushing demand of the one who had lived there since the beginning, and who would undoubtedly live there long after man was entirely forgotten.